I'm not hugely used to using Teams, so apologies if anything goes wrong. And I also want to make one other apology, which is that I am cat sitting, so it's not my cat, not trained to my house. But there's a cat here who may at any moment try and jump in front of the camera. I've done my best to prevent that happening, but if that happens, please don't be alarmed. Okay, so I have taken the advice of Torsten and Leah to pitch this at a level of people who maybe are not hugely familiar with Celtic studies or medieval Gaelic or Irish literature. I see some names in the participants list that will very much not fit that description, so I hope that they'll indulge me and won't feel that this is pitched too low for them. But I will just share my screen now, and we'll hope this goes well. Is that, hold on, I need to do this here. So are you seeing that full screen slide? Okay, great, not presenter view. Okay, very good, thank you so much. So it's been really good to learn about the Reading Scotland initiative over the last few months, courtesy of Torsten's emails and the publicity available online, so thank you very much. As people might know, Scotland, Ireland, Germany has long been a productive intellectual nexus, not only for Celtic studies as a whole, but for the specific subfield of Celtic studies that I am concerned with this evening. So with that in mind, I thought I would just begin by noting the career and intellectual legacy of one German scholar of Old Irish language and literature, whose career had notable stages in Scotland and in Ireland. This is Cumaill. Born in Hamburg in 1858, the teenage Maya lived in Edinburgh, I think, to learn English. And then afterwards, when already a lecturer in Liverpool, where he had already developed interests in Celtic languages and philology, he took up a concurrent temporary appointment at the University of Glasgow. He lectured there on Celtic languages and campaigned for the establishment of a permanent department of Celtic studies. That eventually came into being, although not until quite a bit later in the 1950s, and it's there that I now work. He was one of the greatest contributors to Celtic studies, I suppose we could say, of all time, and I won't try and rehearse his CV for you. But he made his mark in Dublin, as you'll see on the slide, before returning to Germany, where he became Professor of Celtic Philology at the Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin. I've highlighted on the left of the screen just one of his many publications, and it's the one that I draw on most often. And I thought I would do so because it's highly relevant this evening. So this is a publication called Fiannagecht, Irish Poems and Tales Relating to Finn and His Fianna, with an English translation. And the slide is really designed just to introduce some terms that may be unfamiliar to people here. Fiannagecht means a literature about a fian, a term which itself means a type of warband. This term Fiannagecht, which Meyer used as the title of his publication, goes through many iterations, as you can see on the slide, in terms of the spelling, which develops over time, giving us on the second arrow down the sort of modern Irish term an iníocht, which is used to refer to this body of literature that I'll be talking about. And an equivalent term in Scottish Gaelic would be Scailcan na Féine, so that the stories of the fian, the warband. There are many names for the same literature, the same corpus of tales and poems in English, of which you might see quite often the Fenian cycle, the Finn cycle, or Ossianic literature, sometimes the Ossianic cycle. Some of these are perhaps a little complicated or problematic. Fenian, as you might know, is a word with a range of nuances and resonances, and one that I tend to avoid here in Glasgow, where it can have a pejorative meaning applied to the Irish population of the city. But I've highlighted in blue the Finn cycle, which is the term I will use tonight. And underneath that, Ossianic literature, and I'm sure those of you who are Scottish literature experts will know exactly where this term Ossianic comes from. We'll return to it later in the talk. This is, of course, an allusion to James Macpherson's publications from the second half of the 18th century. The publications that collectively are often termed as Ossianic, but the term gets applied back to the original Gaelic language tradition and not merely that English language version thereof. Okay, so that's the term fiannigecht. I've also used the term fian and glossed it as warband, but I thought I would give just a little bit more background to that at this point. I'm quoting from Prentice McCanna in his important article Fiannigecht in the pre-Norman period, and he describes the literary fian being made up of quintessential outsiders associated typically with the liminal areas of forest and wilderness, and owing first loyalty to the fraternity, not the tribe or kingdom. So for students of Celtic studies, that's a sort of basic formula that often comes to mind when they consider the characters that populate the type of literature I'm talking about tonight. Fianna were historically attested warbands. They're not merely a literary phenomenon, but both the historical manifestation of the fian and the literary depiction of the fian have been described together as examples of the anthropological phenomenon of the Männerbund. I hope I'm not just trying to cram in German allusions and German terminology here. It is important to the development of the scholarship on this topic. So as you might know, that refers to a sort of homosocial band of young men, often late adolescents, before they come into their sort of property or adult status. The idea that they can sort of roam on the edges of society and cause a bit of mayhem in a sort of way that's sanctioned by the community before they can re-enter settled society later. But onto the real substance of the talk. Of Scotland's many literatures, the Gaelic corpus might be the least familiar to some people here this evening. But even for those who are very familiar with Scottish Gaelic literature, what is meant by medieval Scottish Gaelic literature might occasion debate. A key point to understand at the outset of what I'm about to say is that in the Middle Ages, Ireland and Scotland, or at least very large parts of what's now Scotland at any given time, formed a common linguistic zone. The shared vernacular language is known as Old Irish for the period of about 600 or AD 600 to about AD 900, and it's known as Middle Irish from about circa AD 900 to circa AD 1200. But it would be equally possible to refer to these phases of the language as Old and Middle Gaelic. I suppose it comes down to a matter of taste and also the sort of shared scholarly expectation of what these languages should be called. I should say that there is a sort of fashion here in my own institution that's not replicated widely, even in Scotland, of using the labels Gaelic rather than Irish to encourage a sense of continuity among our Gaelic students, so that they understand this language and literature to be a phase of the modern language and literature also studied in the department. Okay, so Old Irish or Old Gaelic and Middle Irish or Middle Gaelic are what I might call Gaelic, just to confuse you. G-A-E-L-I-C is the word I'm pronouncing in two different ways, or Goidelic languages. That is to say, they form a branch of the Celtic language family tree and are ancestor languages of modern Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, and Manx. A majority view would be that an identifiably Scottish Gaelic literature does not emerge until the late Middle Ages. For reasons that we'll come to, prior to that, we tend to think about evidence for a medieval Irish literature standing in for medieval Pan-Gaelic literature, perhaps. So, so this majority view that the identifiably Scottish Gaelic literature does not emerge until the late Middle Ages is based on perhaps the idea that the Book of the Dean of Lismore marks a key moment in the genesis of this identifiably Scottish Gaelic literature. So the Book of the Dean of Lismore is a manuscript that was compiled between 1512 and 1526 by the eponymous Dean, Seamus MacGregor or James MacGregor, and his brother Donogh or Duncan. It's rightly been termed the most important manuscript of late medieval Gaelic poetry in Scotland. I'm quoting from my colleague Thomas Clancy, whose name will recur. And it bears witness to Scottish literature's long-standing hybridity. It does this in two key ways: the book's content and the form that its Gaelic texts take. So this most famous of Gaelic books, and one of the earliest, is in fact a record of a number of Scotland's languages, a number of Scotland's written traditions in the 16th century. It contains mostly Gaelic poetry, but also some Scots poetry in prose and some writing in Latin. So you'll just see on the slide a brief summary of what it contains. Mostly poetry, bardic poems, courtly love poems, syllabic verse, and then heroic ballads that I'll return to. Moreover, it bears witness to cultural interaction between Scotland's Highland and Lowland cultures in its presentation of its Gaelic content. The poetry has been, and I'm quoting again from Clancy, transliterated into an orthography based essentially on that of Lowland Scots. Notable among its contents, which I highlighted on the last slide, is a number of poems or heroic ballads about Finn and the Fian, so that was highlighted there in blue. And among these, we find at least one example of a distinctively Scottish Gaelic composition. Unlike other works, it's not likely that this poem could have been composed in Ireland. The poem in question, and I'm very much drawing on the work of Donald Meek mentioned on the slide here from 1990. So the poem in question treats the death of the great Fian warrior Diarmid. As well as an identifiably Scottish provenance here in the Book of the Dean of Lismore, the little image on the slide shows you the opening of the poem. So as well as that identifiably Scottish provenance, the poem's happenings are localised to Scotland. Key place names, here we go. Key place names mentioned in the ballad here on the slide are Glen Shee and Ben Gulliban. Those are in the Scottish Highlands, and their occurrence in tandem suggests a poet familiar with this particular Scottish landscape. It's striking that Irish accounts of the same event, the death of Diarmid, and this is a very productive event in the literary tradition, both written and oral over many centuries. But it's very striking that Irish iterations of the same story, the death of Diarmid, also locate the event to Ben Gulliban. But this is understood as an Irish location specifically, and what's now best known as Ben Bulben in County Sligo, made famous internationally by its association with W.B. Yeats. There's something, I think, quite pleasing in the complicated story that the Book of the Dean of Lismore has to tell us about Scottish Gaelic literary tradition. As an artefact, it's a thoroughly Scottish cultural product. But nonetheless, the bulk of its contents align it to Irish Gaelic literary tradition. But there's a risk in focusing on the Book of the Dean as the start of an identifiably Scottish Gaelic literature. It's, of course, not the start of the writing of Gaelic in Scotland, nor is it likely that it represents an early phase in storytelling or poetic composition in the Gaelic language of Scotland. So the big question, I suppose, that arises quite early is, where are our early Scottish Gaelic manuscripts? We have rather limited evidence for distinctively Scottish Gaelic being written in the early Middle Ages. In part, this could be explained with reference to a standard literary language being in use that would mask dialectical features, so that manuscript provenance and the content of the tales become very important in arguing for Scottish over Irish identity. But we do have some writing of Gaelic earlier than things like the Book of the Dean. And an important piece of evidence is the Book of Deer, produced in 12th century Aberdeenshire. This is a text that is primarily in Latin, a liturgical text, but with Gaelic text written in as well. I don't know if the slide is really effectively showing this, but you can probably see quite a different style of writing between the top half and then the lower half of the page. It's a different script in use for the different languages. Okay, so that's one thing we can point to. There is writing in Gaelic in at least the 12th century in Scotland. So that ability existed, the technology and the skills were present. We might look also, when we're thinking about the writing of texts in Scottish Gaelic in the earlier Middle Ages, we might look to the evidence of Iona. Probably a place familiar to many of us, founded in 563 by Saint Columba, as he tends to be known in Scotland, or Columcille in Ireland. And this became a major intellectual and artistic centre quite quickly for the whole Irish Sea zone. And we know that religious texts and poetry were composed there, both in Latin and in Gaelic. So there's some of the details there on the slide, although perhaps we don't need to go through it in any great detail. So we have places that were set up to produce writing of literature in Gaelic that had easy access to what we now term mainland Scotland. Obviously, Iona is a small island off Mull in the Western Isles. So the final sort of piece of evidence that we might want to consider in terms of this situation of the writing of Gaelic in the early Middle Ages, or indeed perhaps not so early, we're now talking about around 1200 in this case, we might want to think about personnel moving across the Irish Sea between Ireland and Scotland in this zone of Gaelic language being spoken. And one example is this, Muireadach Albanach, or Muireadach the Scot, or Scottish Muireadach O'Dóigh, who, despite his nickname, was an Irishman, born in what's now County Meath, and we know that he has a flower wit of about 1200. When he dies in the annals in Ireland, he's recorded as Ullav Éireann agus Alban. So Ullav is a term of sort of a learned order, so a poetic grade, or a grade of learning. The modern, it's used in the modern language to refer to professor. So he is that for both Ireland, Éireann agus Alban, Scotland. We know that he was a poet in Ireland, and he basically sought refuge in Scotland, having run into a bit of bother in Ireland. And this is a literary motif that comes up again and again. The idea that Scotland exists as a sort of alternative option for speakers of Irish, I suppose, from Ireland. So we get that hibernocentric view that Scotland is there in the hinterland as a sort of option, a little bit like England, I suppose, in modern Irish literature, that you can sort of go away to London as an Irish person who speaks English. Perhaps the sort of same idea is there in that hibernocentric literature from the Middle Ages. Okay, so I suppose what I just wanted to do there is to say that we have lots of elements in place in the Middle Ages, in the earlier Middle Ages in Scotland, that would suggest that the writing of Gaelic literature was possible. What we don't have is positive evidence for this in the shape of earlier manuscripts. Why might that be? Well, this is one of the great sort of questions that trouble Celticists in many ways. I suppose we have three different ways of explaining what's going on. Have manuscripts simply been lost, destroyed, or lost and decayed, degraded over time? The weather, the climate is not very conducive to the survival of early manuscripts on vellum, for example. As well as, we know, Viking attacks on places like Iona, where we might expect books to have been damaged or lost. We could also say that while Ireland and Scotland shared a great deal in terms of Gaelic culture and intellectual life, we might not assume that there was the same interest in writing manuscripts on either side of the equation. Perhaps there was a weaker manuscript culture in Scotland anyway, for whatever reason. When Wilson MacLeod, lately of the University of Edinburgh, has treated the question of bardic poetry, medieval bardic poetry in Scotland and Ireland in a slightly later period, he has also wanted to draw attention to the importance of the 18th and 19th century scribal cultures in Ireland and Scotland in explaining the loss of texts, if not manuscripts, from the earlier period. So we know that in Ireland in the 18th and 19th century, there was a particular vibrant scribal culture that saw 18th and 19th century scribes return to and recycle earlier texts and to write new copies, which had a greater chance of surviving to us in the 20th and 21st centuries than the earlier books they might have been using. But we didn't get that equivalent process happening in Scotland. So perhaps that's also an important stage in explaining what's going on. Okay, so I suppose I want to change gears a little bit and move on now to the 18th century and mention James Macpherson, he of Ossian fame. We mentioned Ossianic literature as a label earlier on. I suppose I'm mentioning James Macpherson to say that there is a very specific Scottish Finn cycle tradition in which James Macpherson and the 18th century looms incredibly large. As you might know, I'm sure you do, in a Scottish literature hub, there's no need for me to labour the point as to who Macpherson was and what the Ossianic controversy was. But it is worth, I think, spending some time on the question of what type of Finn cycle works were available to Macpherson as a way of thinking about the nature of that medieval Finn cycle tradition in Scotland. You know that Macpherson claims to have found, old books in Gaelic and a pretty complete poem, truly epic, concerning Fingal, his name for Finn or fian. And I've also included Derek Thompson's pithy sort of characterization of this as no doubt mostly bluff. Certainly, there was specifically Scottish Finn cycle material available to Macpherson of the type that we saw in the book of the Dean of Lismore, although he's much more likely to have accessed that tradition through contemporary oral recitation. Thinking not of James Macpherson specifically, but of other 18th century evidence, we can look to another Macpherson, Ewan Macpherson from Badenoch, who was a schoolmaster and was born around 1727. And he has told us that he very often heard poems of Ossian relative to the Fingalians, the fian, in other words, or the fian, the warband, repeated in his youth. It was an entertainment in winter's nights to repeat the poems of Ossian or to hear them. And he says this is true not only in his home place, but all over the Highlands. James Macpherson, meanwhile, says that he admired the poems in the original very early and gathered part of them from tradition for his own amusement. And indeed, James Macpherson probably did have reasonable Gaelic. I know that's a point that has sort of been debated back and forth, but certainly he grew up in a family and an area where access to Gaelic culture and oral tradition was inevitable. James Macpherson also formed part of a literary network centred in Edinburgh, but also in the Scottish Highlands, based around Logie Rate. This is centred on the person of Adam Ferguson, the very well-known Scottish Enlightenment figure, but himself a Scottish Gael from Highland Perthshire. Part of this literary fashion and network at the time was a resurgence of interest in Gaelic and an interest in associating Gaelic with Enlightenment ideas and the university training that these men, and they were largely all men that we know about, were enjoying. We know that collecting of material, not just Finn cycle material, but very often Finn cycle material, was underway in Macpherson's lifetime and before he himself published any of his so-called translations. So we know that Jerome Stone was collecting in Perthshire, MacNichol in Argyll, and James Maclagan in Highland Perthshire, and also with the Black Watch overseas. I'll take a moment just to say something about James Maclaggan, as I have a great interest in him and have done some work on him in the past. There's a forthcoming volume with the Scottish Gaelic Text Society, a volume of essays on James Macpherson, and also a website to be released to the public as soon as our library technicians are able to get it released. I'm sorry, the cat has now appeared. So the Reverend James Maclaggan, whose portrait appears here, has left about 254 manuscripts that are in the University of Glasgow Library. This is an enormous amount, a huge proportion of what survives to us from 18th century Gaelic literature. There's about 630 items, mostly Gaelic verse, and many different hands, showing the network that he was tapping into as he sought to source texts from all over Scotland. He had a network of informers, collectors who were interviewing oral informants and writing out texts for him. Many of them were Finn cycle texts. And James Maclaggan himself he was a Church of Scotland minister, as many of these men were, and he became the chaplain to the Black Watch, travelling with them to Ireland and to America, where he was able to continue his work on Finn cycle and other Scottish Gaelic topics, as his letters tell us. Excuse me. Well, okay, the cat has decided to move us on, but that's no harm. I wanted to mention also, if we kind of move back in time from the 18th century, another important date. I'm so sorry. This is not my cat and not my cat proofing. Another important time to mention is to go a little bit further back into the 16th century and talk about the time of the Scottish Reformation. And all I wanted to do was focus here, not on that moment of 18th century collection, but to go back a century, 2 centuries beforehand, to point again to a sort of oral tradition that was flourishing then, focus on the Finn cycle, so that we can argue quite credibly for a continuity of this oral tradition. I'm thinking about the first printed work in either Scottish or Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, and it's the Scottish edition of the Book of Common Order from Carswell, and he includes in it, sorry, I've skipped by that, a very important and interesting introduction or justification. So he's added this to his Scottish edition. And in that justification as to what he's doing and why he's doing it, he offers his thoughts on Gaelic language and oral tradition. And why we want to have, he says, the Holy Bible printed in Gaelic as it has been printed in Latin and English. And effectively, for Carswell, this move into print, into Gaelic printed books and away from Gaelic oral culture has an important moral dimension. He wants to redirect the attention of Gaels of his time away, as he says here, from hurtful, lying, worldly tales about the heroes and Fionn McCool, Finn McCovel in the earlier language, and his warriors. So we get this Finn cycle oral tradition written explicitly into this first printed Gaelic book. Just as an aside, if you know the medieval site of Donad at Argyll, it has a footprint carved into the rock there that seems to have been a medieval inaugurational ritual. The rightful king would put his foot into this shape as part of the inauguration rite. But in the 19th century, this is re-understood as Ustien's footprint, the idea that Finn and his son Uiscin and the fian were giants, and so have left their mark on the landscape. So this is a tradition in the 19th century, but in exactly the area that Carswell was based in, where he told us a few centuries before that people were more interested in Finn than Christianity. I'm moving back in time now to consider some other Scottish evidence, and I'm moving out of explicitly the Gaelic cultural zone and into Latin and Scots. So I'm thinking about Hector Boyce, also known as Boethius, a hugely important thinker in the time, who published in Paris a history of the Scots, Scotland, I suppose, in that sense. And he makes mention of Finn McCool, as the vulgar kind of call him, and tells us that Finn or Fian was a Scot who lived at the time of St. Patrick. He's a giant and a hunter, and that lots of stories are told about him, just like they are about King Arthur. Moving back in time again, we have evidence from other Scottish thinkers and writers. I have never learnt Scots, especially not historical Scots, so I won't try and read this out. There'll be many of you who know how to do it better than me, but you can see highlighted here references to this character Finn McCool again and again. In the Gavin Douglas one, we see this reference to Gull Macmorna, another very famous warrior in this literature. Moving back in time again, we've got William Dunbar making reference to Finn McCool, and our earliest reference, or the earliest one known to me, and I'm indebted to MacKillop's book on iterations of Finn for this information, John Barber, so in the 14th century in his The Bruce, has a Gaelic-speaking character, the Lord of Lorne, from Argyll, same area we've just considered in relation to Carswell. He's depicted talking again about Gull Macmorn, so this traditional sort of warrior enemy of Finn, our hero. And we hear that he was accustomed to have from Fingal his company in right good order. So again, this is showing us not just that these characters were known to Scots speakers from at least the 14th century, but that elements of the story, the sort of dramatic setup that is incredibly productive down to the 20th century are there in Scotland in the 14th century. If they're known to Scots speakers, surely they were flourishing and known to Gaels, to speakers of Scottish Gaelic. Okay, so I want to move on now, having a hope trying to hint at the fact that all evidence is there for a flourishing oral tradition about Finn in Scotland from throughout the Middle Ages down to the 18th century, and before that to have suggested that the infrastructure was there for writing of this type of material, even if we don't actually get that material surviving. And I suppose what I want to move on to for the next section of the talk is just to think about how some of these Finn cycle tales present Scotland. I've already mentioned this idea that for historical figures, our historical poet Muireadach Albanach, and indeed for St. Columba, Scotland was a place that someone could go to when things went wrong in Ireland. It was a zone available to them. And that's certainly a wide motif present in medieval Irish Gaelic literature, or unidentifiable, unlocated Gaelic literature, perhaps, that if you like, there's a centre-periphery relationship between Ireland and Scotland, with Scotland as the hinterland to the larger or depicted as more important political zone of Ireland. I'm very sorry about the cat. So I suppose I want to think about this a little bit more. In wider medieval Irish literary tradition, there have been studies of how Alba, Scotland, or indeed the north of Britain, the meaning of this term depends on the particular time that the texts are composed, what these geographical spaces connotated for Irish audiences and authors in the early Middle Ages. I haven't prepared slides on this, but in texts that are not from the Finn cycle, a pattern can roughly be outlined in which that centre-periphery model is in place that I've mentioned, but also that Scotland has an exoticism, a glamour, an association with magic or with esoteric learning. So those ideas are present again and again. So we kind of take that with us into our consideration of Finn cycle literature specifically. I want to focus on one case study, which is a work that I know very well, Ogul of Nishnoruk, the Colloquy of the Ancients is how this work is normally translated. It is, oh, hold on, I forgot that is this way. It's a rather complex narrative and a very lengthy one. The printed edition comes to about 8,000 lines. So it gives you a sense of the kind of volume of that text, and the modern translation pictured on the slide is the length of a modern sort of hard paperback novel. So it's a lengthy work, effectively one of the longest works written in any Gaelic language at any phase of its existence. So it's a significant work, and we can look to it to think about our issue of how Alba, Scotland, is presented in Fincycle material. It is a rather complex narrative structure, a frame tale. So this sees St. Patrick, obviously the converter of the Irish, who we date to the 5th century. And the story imagines him conversing with Cuilche and Oisin. These are members of the fian of Finn. Oisin, known as Ossian in Macpherson's works, is Finn's son. So the frame tale imagines a conversation between St. Patrick and these ancient warriors who have somehow lived to be hundreds of years old to meet the saint and witness the conversion of the Irish to Christianity and a huge cultural upheaval and shift away from their cultural expectations of the country. So if it is a frame, it also has subtales or framed tales. And those tales are set in the heyday of Finn's fian, which is dated to the 3rd century AD. Now, those tales are largely, but not exclusively, set in Ireland. And as we'll see, Scotland comes to the fore a little bit more here. I've just put a reference at the bottom to the edition, which of course is a German product from 1900 from Whitley Stokes. But we are fortunate in that we have a modern translation, Dooley and Rose version, which came out with Oxford World's Classics depicted on the slide. But we haven't had a more recent edition than 1900, which is a shame, perhaps. And I've also pictured just one of the 5 sort of manuscripts of this text there as well. Okay, so there are frequent references to Scotland throughout the text. I did a quick search just to sort of get some facts and figures together. And in 8,000 lines or so of the printed text, I think there are maybe about 60 references to Alban. So it's not all that frequent, but it is a very sizable part of the sort of imagined world of the Ogilv. Many of these references, indeed the vast majority of them, are as part of a sort of repeated formula in which Ireland and Scotland are associated and not particularly differentiated. So one small example here, and this is very indicative of the type of way that Scotland comes into the story, is this idea that something is the best both in Ireland and Scotland, or the best that could be found in either Ireland or Scotland, or the most fearsome warrior of Ireland and Scotland, or just this idea that Ireland and Scotland can be associated as a sort of sense unit. So here we'll see Patrick asks Cuilche, so in the past, he says, did you have a musician in the fian? And Cuilche says, yes, we did. And we had the single best musician who was in Ireland or in Scotland. So that's the sort of quintessential way that Scotland appears. It's important to say, however, that despite the clear sense of communicating a cultural zone that encompasses both Ireland and Scotland, there is a political differentiation being acknowledged in the text. So the second most frequent way that the term Alba, Scotland, occurs in the text, and I haven't given you an example, unfortunately, is references to the king of Alba, or a son of a king, or a son of the king of Alba. So these are very frequent characters. In long lists of warriors of the fian, we'll have characters who are the sons of the kings of Alba, Scotland. Characters, we sometimes get women who travel to seek out Finn and his companions to ask for protection or help, sometimes because they are married in Scotland to abusive husbands and wish to flee them, or they're being made to marry a man they don't love in Alba, and so they seek instead a future in Ireland. So again, this idea of a cultural continuity, a place that it is possible to live easily in either side of the equation, can work in that sense. But very notably, we also have action set in Alba, and this is, I suppose, why I've zoned in on this particular text rather than any other early Finn cycle text to illustrate my point. In many other poems, ballads, which start to appear in the tradition from about 1200, Alba is that alternative to Ireland, a place that you can go for a phase of your career as a warrior, or as an aristocrat, potentially being in exile. You'll move from Ireland to Scotland, regroup, recuperate, come back, and defeat your enemy and take up your patrimony. So that is a very common way that we see Alba functioning. But I wanted to focus on this example instead, because it's doing something a bit different. It's locating action to the place, Alba, rather than just seeing Alba as a sort of interval in the story. So the key scene is set up in Oglav na Snorg, the colloquy of the ancients, as such. Again, it's part of this frame tale conversation between St. Patrick and the warrior Cumaill, where Patrick is seeking information about Ireland's past, and particularly about the lifetime of the fian and of Finn. And he asks the question, Math a anam a Cumaill fóric, Ga Shalach is far further an Ian Riamh a Néireann no a Nalapan. So, well, Cumaill, said Patrick, what was the best hunting that the fian ever had in Ireland or in Scotland? Hunting, as you might remember from a very early slide, courtesy of Pontius McCanna's definition of the literary fian, hunting is the characteristic activity of the fian. And this idea that the best hunting that the fian ever had, either in Ireland or in Scotland, we would expect, based on the patterns evident in the text and in the wider place of Alba, Scotland, in medieval Irish literature, we'd expect the answer to be in Ireland, because when we get this repeated formula, are in Ireland or in Scotland, the answer is inevitably in Ireland. The very next little section after this section that I'm talking about has a sort of mirror question where Patrick asks Cumaill something else and says, what was the best of a different thing in Ireland or in Scotland? And the answer is, of course, an Irish example. But here, this very prominent activity, hunting, the very best example of hunting that they ever had, Cumaill sort of surprises you as a reader, because he whips out an answer that is Scottish and not Irish. He tells, there's a brief prose section where he describes that it was in Scotland, and in specifically the place Arran, the Isle of Arran, off the west coast of Scotland. And I'll just share a translation here. I've shared a translation from my colleague Thomas Clancy's edited collection, The Triumph Tree, Scotland's Earliest Poetry, AD 550 to 1350, where he and his collaborators made very bold and expansive claims, I suppose, for what we define as Scottish Gaelic literature. So here, Oglav na Snorg, a text that presents us with this poem, I suppose, is being claimed as a Scottish text. It is incredibly Hiberno-centric in its action, its focus, its ideas of St. Patrick, the converter of the Irish, speaking to Finn, the legendary hero, or speaking about Finn, the legendary hero of the Irish. I think weighs this, tilts the scales towards Irishness far more than pan-Gaelicness for the text. But it's interesting to consider this particular passage as an interest, as evidence for Scottish Gaelic literature. I don't know if that's large enough for you to read very well. It's a very nice translation, so I hope you'll have a moment to read it. It describes the site of this hunt that the fian enjoy as Arran of the Manny Deer, ocean touching its shoulders, island where troops are ruined, ridge where blue spears are blooded. I won't read the whole thing out, and of course we're missing the artistry of the original text here, but it gives you a sense of the content at least. So high above the sea its summit, dear its green growth, rare its bogland, blue island of glens, of horses, of peaked mountains, oaks and armies. I suppose I wanted to stress that section as well, the peaked mountains, because it's important, I think, in deciding that this is a poem about the Scottish Arran and not the Irish Arran. We think of the Arran Islands, but also of Arran Moor off Donegal. I think the description of the landscape certainly is more fitting for Scottish Arran, which has very dramatic mountains, not shared, for example, by the Arran Islands of County Galway. Certainly, place name scholars have not doubted that this is a poem referring to the Scottish Arran. W.J. Watson, in his landmark work on Scottish place names, certainly accepts it as such. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what's happened there. Okay, I think you can see, I've got a notice saying that PowerPoint needs access to a camera, but hopefully you can see things okay. I'm coming to the end anyway, so we won't labour the point. So there's very good grounds for seeing this as a Scottish poem. Now, you might be asking, what is it in this poem, if I read out the whole translation, that relates to Finn and his fian, or indeed the wider story or action of Oglamh na Shinúrach specifically? And that would be an excellent question to ask, because the answer is not much. If we strip away the prose frame that goes around this poem, there's nothing that says this is a Finn cycle poem. Indeed, although the Finn cycle is very much associated with nature poetry, this is a rare example in Oglamh na Shinúrach of what we might call a pure nature poem, a poem really just describing and reveling in the beauty of nature, rather than using natural imagery to make some other kind of point about the fian or the fian lifestyle. So the likelihood may well be, as Clancy says in his preface to the poem, that the Oglamh, the text he says here, has attracted into it a number of poems which must originally have been original compositions. This dual-like poem on Arran is almost certainly one such, and I would find it hard to have a counter-argument to that. I think we need to start wrapping up given the time. And I suppose what I want to conclude with is just some thoughts about how we can use this example of our Finn cycle text, which is definitely Irish in its focus and I think its interest primarily, but how we can use its excursion geographically into Scotland to reflect on the possibility of early medieval Scottish Gaelic Finn cycle literature. For this section to make sense, what was the best hunting that the fian ever had in Ireland or Scotland? And for the answer to have been a Scottish example, I think that allows for the possibility of there being circulating in Ireland as well as in Scotland many more tales that located the fian in Scotland at this period. I've mentioned that there are multiple allusions to the fian and members of the fian spending time in Scotland, but I think this just reinforces that here within the text Oglamh na Shinúrach. If we zone out a little bit to offer some conclusions, we can return to the difficulties that exist in wishing to talk in any definitive way about early medieval Scottish Gaelic literature, either oral or written. But the evidence points towards a flourishing oral tradition of Finn cycle literature in Gaelic Scotland, as in Ireland. In Ireland, we can say that the oral culture ran in parallel with a probably much smaller written transmission of Finn cycle texts. In Scotland, we can't assert that with confidence, although the possibility remains that the same was true, but that identifiably Scottish manuscripts simply have not survived to modern times. As a parting remark, though, I'd like to move away from the case of the missing manuscripts and focus instead on the ways in which Scotland's writers have had a highly distinctive role to play in advertising the existence and perhaps the merits of Finn cycle literature to wider international audiences. We can think of the example of Hector Boyce publishing in Paris and gaining wide international readership for his Latin text, which mentions the stories of Finn and discusses him as a a historical or literary character. And we can think, of course, of James Macpherson in the 18th century. In both cases, we see Scottish writers acting as the most significant conduits of this tradition across linguistic borders in their day, raising awareness of this material beyond the Gaelic world. We might say that that baton, the sort of internationalisation or publicisation of the Finne cycle, passed in general to Irish writers at the end of the 19th century and thereafter. As you'll know, the Celtic revival very much had an interest in medieval literature and how that could be used to form a new English language literary tradition in Ireland. Yeats we've already mentioned, and of course his first large publication was a version of a Finne cycle tale when he wrote about the wandering of Oisin. So that baton may have passed from Scotland to Ireland in the late 19th century, but who's to know when it will pass back? We don't yet know what the fortunes of Finne cycle literature will be in the 21st century. And I look with interest at my many students who are talented creative writers and who take courses on the Finne cycle to see if that baton will return to a Scottish writer in our own time. So thank you very much. I'll end it there.